This is an effective and environmentally sensitive approach to pest management using a combination of common sense practices. And we're going to try to break some of that down today so that we can have some applied things that we can do to help promote our pollinators and to help preserve them throughout the fall and winter months. One point that I want to make is that IPM is not a principle that can or should be strictly and equally applied to every situation. Some of us have giant backyards, some of us are managing farms, some of us volunteer in different green spaces, some of us manage parks or recreational areas, but we can take these concepts or these philosophies and incorporate them into the management system that we have. So hopefully everybody can gain a little bit from what we're going to talk about today. Another point I want to make out is to use this great big word called multidisciplinary. So when we talk about IPM, we're combining a lot of different disciplines of science and a lot of disciplines of how we apply things. This could be from horticulture to entomology to weed sciences to even looking at how we engineer our different tools and production systems to be more efficient. So the idea is that IPM is a holistic management practice, and this is a very large, somewhat complicated graph that we're going to break down. But the idea, if you look on the outside ring of this figure, is that we're talking about economic viability, environmental safety, and social acceptance. And these are the three pillars of sustainability. So IPM is built from an idea of being sustainable in the practices that we're using. The inner ring is the people that are involved in these different interactions. And then the bubbles inside of this ring, we're going to break down a little bit more so that we can kind of understand where IPM is coming from. So IPM relies on communication. We're going to be working on staying up to date with information, with working within groups and talking to each other about what's happening in our areas. We also want to think about planning and organizing. This really is important when we start to talk about our pollinators, because we want to start planning what our garden spaces are going to look like, or what our green spaces pollinators are going to look like. So thinking about your planning and organization is part of an IPM system. Pest management is part of an IPM system as well, because we know that pests are going to be interacting with our green spaces, and a lot of the ways that we manage our pests could have negative effects on our pollinators. We want to try to find a balance between that. And we also want to utilize our knowledge and resources. So participating in things like workshops and groups like this help us to understand and gain more knowledge about what's available for us in our systems. And the whole reason that we want to practice IPM is this idea that we're going to be improving ecosystem services, which is another big term, but if we break it down, it's the idea that the ecosystem provides us with different benefits, and we want to maximize those as much as possible. So it could be for going to our state parks, and it's a recreational benefit that the ecosystem's giving us. It could be for purifying our air or our water. And it could be that pollination is an ecosystem service for us. So tying this into our pollinators, we want to talk about this idea of integrated pest and pollinator management. Like I said, pests and pollinators interact in the environment. So when we manage our pests, we're also managing our pollinators. So we want to come up with sustainable approaches to manage both at the same time. So we're going to mostly focus on the pollinators today. I'm happy to talk more about pests in the future. But here are just a few of our pollinators and how they end up interacting in our different production systems. So we have honeybees in an apple orchard. So any type of management for pests that's happening in that apple orchard, those bees are going to be exposed to. And then we have a lot of pollinators that are important in our agriculture crops, be it specialists like the squash bees, or bees that are utilizing things like our tomato flowers for different pollen resources. So pollinators interact with agriculture. But we have more pollinators than just bees. A lot of times we focus on the bees, and the management techniques that we use to preserve bees and to help establish them is also going to help our other pollinators. But it's important to point out that we have things like bats and birds, all the way down to flies and butterflies and beetles and things that accidentally pollinate our plants while they come to get nectar from them. So we have a lot of different pollinators in our community. And we know that these pollinators are at risk. There's a lot of threats to their environment. So this could be big things like climate change that's going to have an impact over time. And it can be smaller things like the use of chemical insecticides or herbicide or chemical use for our pest management that can have an cause a problem for our pollinators. Everything down to urbanization and land fragmentation, which is a huge threat, because what we're doing is we're taking something that was a native habitat for them, and when we establish a subdivision, let's say, we're breaking apart that habitat and completely paving it over. And so now we need to think about how we can break that fragmentation down and create habitat for our pollinators within inside of that to help maintain their populations. So like I said, one of the main things that is causing a problem for our pollinators is chemical applications that we use during our pest management. And there's a lot of ways our pollinators can come in contact with that. It could be through the nectar and the pollen that they're drinking. It could be through dust. It could be through runoff in the water supply, soil contamination, and then they can communicate, or they can share those pathogens or chemicals with one another. So they come into contact with a lot of these chemicals through these different ways. So when we want to talk about pollinators and how to keep them healthy and keep their populations up, we want to kind of think about their biology. So we're going to start with just a little rundown of who the pollinators are and where they would like to overwinter. So pollinators, bees are one of our biggest categories. There's over 1,000 native bee species to New Mexico. So we're number 3 in the country for the number of species that we have. So that means there's just a lot of diversity across the state in the type of pollinators that we have. We have some bees that are generalists, meaning that they will go to a bunch of different kinds of flowers, and we have some that are specialists, and these are ones that are going to be specific to a plant type or a flower, a kind of flower. We also have a lot of honeybees in the state, and these are generalist foragers, and they're a category called cavity nesting. So we'll kind of get into what some of these different nesting categories are. But if we look at a basic bee life stage, in the fall, around this time, we have our adult bees, and they are provisioning nests. And these nests can be in different places and look a little bit different, and I'll show you some examples of that. But they provision these nests with pollen and nectar for their larvae. They lay an egg on this pollen ball. The larva, which is the immature bee, hatches. It kind of looks a little bit like a little worm. It eats that pollen. It goes into a resting stage, which is called a pupa stage, and not much happens here. This is a hibernation stage, kind of an in-between before they become an adult. So it's important to note that a lot of our pollinators, depending on what species they are, they might overwinter as this egg on this pollen ball. They might overwinter as a pupa or a larva or an adult. It just depends on the species. So we kind of need to think about all of these different life stages when we're thinking about how we want to preserve and help maintain our pollinators. So let's talk about nesting sites. So we have a lot of soil nesting pollinators. They often dig into loose soils. Their nests can be anywhere from 6 to 12 inches deep in the ground, and they can have multiple chambers, meaning that there are multiple bees that are going to come out of that one nest. So it's the female bee who's provisioning and making this nest in the ground. We also have cavity nesting bees or stem nesting bees. So these are bees that are looking for a safe place to build a nest and build chambers within a reed or a wood structure. And so these are going to look a little bit different than our ground nesting bees. We also have butterflies and moths that are a lot of pollinators, and this is the other group that I'll point to, because when we manage for our bees, we're also managing for things like butterflies and moths. Their life cycle is very similar. They have an egg stage that then becomes a larva, or what we're more familiar with calling it, a caterpillar. They have that pupa stage, which what we call it is the cocoon stage, and then we have an adult. So right now we see a lot of our adults, and they're getting ready to lay their eggs for the winter, and then the immatures will overwinter in one of these stages. So if we look at the number of species of moths and butterflies in New Mexico, we have well over 300 species. So we're also very diverse in our butterflies and moths. We also have several major groups that we can break them down into. So we have larger ones, our larger butterflies that have little tails at the end of their wings. Those are our swallowtails, all the way down to really small, tiny butterflies. So we have a huge diversity, and these are visiting different flowers. They're pollinators to a lot of our different plants. We also have a lot of different moth species, some that we're probably familiar with. Now, some of our moths can be pests as well, but they are pollinators. So they are doing some good things, but these might be more familiar to us as miller moths. Maybe a lot of people remember in the spring we had a lot of moths emerging, and got a lot of phone calls about that, but those are a type of moth that we see a lot in New Mexico. And then we have things like hawk moths, sphinx moths, and hummingbird moths. It's the same name for very similar types of moths that we see here. And there's many others. We could go all the way and talk about this forever, but we've got limited time, so let's continue on. Moths and butterflies look very different depending on what we're looking at. We can have the larva stage that could have lots of hairs on it. They may have no hairs. They may be solitary, meaning they're by themselves, or they may be in a group. Their pupa and their cocoons, this is things that we're going to be seeing this fall mostly. So some of these odd-shaped structures, they don't always spin silk around them. They don't always have a hard case. Sometimes they use natural elements to wrap around their cocoon for protection. So they look a little bit different, but it's still this kind of resting stage. So an important note, this is where pest management ties back into pollinator management, is that it's good to know and to acknowledge your pests. So this is a picture of two flies. They're both yellow and black. They both have red eyes. They're both about 1/4 inch big. So I don't know about you, but I know I need a hand lens to be able to see the difference between these two flies. But on the left-hand side, we have a leaf mining fly, and this is a pest that we would recommend different management techniques for. But on the right-hand fly, we have a syrphid or a hover fly, and it's a pollinator in our gardens, and its immatures, which is this picture underneath of it, that's a larva of that fly attacking an aphid in our garden. So their larvae are predators. So syrphid fly, adult, is a pollinator, and the immature, that's a predator, and they'll take on things that are bigger than they are, and they are really great at helping us manage pests in the garden. So if you have questions about pest management and what you might find in your garden, it's awesome that NMSU has a plant diagnostic clinic. We also take insect specimens. These can go through your county extension agent and get shipped down to main campus, and we will go through and identify what that is and tell you how you can either manage your pests or how you can help the pollinators that you're seeing. So let's talk about implementing IPM for fall and winter. So one thing that's important to think about in New Mexico is that we are a very diverse state in terms of our ecoregions and our ecology. So we have 7 distinct ecoregions, which means that there's 7 distinct regions where different species of insects and plants and flowers interact. Then we have a huge shift in elevation. So some pollinators that we see are going to want higher elevation, some are going to want lower elevation. And then we also have our different growing zones, which you're probably familiar with if you're planting in your garden, to know when frost times are happening. And the whole point of this is that as I share information, remember that in your part of the state, some of this is going to apply really well, and some of it we may have to change around a little bit to make it fit. So IPPM doesn't fit one size fits all, but you can take elements of that and apply them to your system. So the main point of this is pollinators need resources, and part of when we start to think about creating resources for them is that we need to think about variety. So that's the reason I have it on here 3 times, is when you start to design a pollinator habitat or you think about preserving your pollinators, think about variety, variety, variety. Think about the different color of blooms that you're planting. Think about the different shape of those blooms. Think about your nectar and pollen content, the blooming period, and what species of plants you're planting, whether or not they're annuals or perennials. So we're going to break some of these ideas down just a little bit further. So I'm sure you weren't expecting to see a picture of insect mouth parts today, but I'm an entomologist, so I have to include it. And the reason that I'm including it is if you look at the different shape of these insect mouth parts, some of them are long straws for sucking nectar out of plants. Some of them, like our bee, which is here in the center, has more of a tongue-like mouth part for lapping nectar up. Or if we look at like our beetles, they're more chewing mouth parts that are going to be collecting pollen and chewing it more so than one of these other types of insects. So when we think about mouth parts, that correlates to flower shape. So different shapes of flowers that we plant in our garden attract different types of pollinators. So this could be a whole talk in and of itself, but we'll just go over a couple of them. So we have disc-shaped flowers. These are very open. A lot of different types of pollinators can access the pollen and the nectar content. We have tubular or trumpet-shaped flowers. These are often most attractive to things like our butterflies and our moths because they have that long piercing or that long sucking mouthpart that can go all the way down into the plant. We have a lot of bowl-shaped flowers, and that provides a lot of access for different beetles and things that maybe can't get into those tiny cracks and crevices that other flowers have. We have lipped flowers, so this is going to be your different peas, and I think this is an example of cowpea, and some of our snapdragons, and these have like a little landing pad for pollinators to be able to reach down into the flower and access that nutrients. And then we also have a lot of wind pollinated plants, and these are great because they can provide a lot of pollen for our insects. But one thing to think about is that we don't want to just have wind pollinated plants because this is kind of like feeding our pollinators a bunch of carbs when they also need the nutrients that nectar is also going to supply. So this is kind of the idea of just thinking about the shapes that you're putting into your garden so that all of our different types of pollinators, from honeybees to bumblebees to some of our really tiny pollinating bees to beetles and butterflies, can all get access to. So when we think about our gardens or the space that we are designing for pollinators, this can be a small space, it could be an entire field. It just depends on what scale you're looking for, and I'm happy to work with you if you've got questions or ideas on this. But this is just an example of a pollinator garden and kind of the idea that we need to be thinking about what species we're planting. We encourage a lot of plants that are native to this region because that's what our pollinators are going to be searching for and using. We want to think about their blooming time. So if you see on the right-hand side of that chart, this garden was planted in a way so that there's blooms early in the season, through the summer, and into the late season. And there's a lot of different shaped plants in this yard. So some are big bushy plants, some are small plants, but all of them will be providing nutrients to our pollinators. All right, we also want to think about different resources. So right now, if we go outside and we start to look around to see what things are still blooming and haven't been starting to fade for the winter, we see that there's still a lot of pollinators around. This, I think I took this picture after the frost last year, and we had some sunflowers and ragwort that was still blooming in our garden, and I went out and I took some pictures. These are our late season pollinators. What they're trying to do is collect as much pollen and nectar as possible to provision those nests before a hard frost kills off most of the adults, so that the next generation is ready in the spring. So when we think about fall, we want to think about different flowers that are going to be blooming. So we have a lot of helianthus, a lot of verbena, different types of flowers that are going to be planting. And I have some resource lists that I'm happy to share because I know this kind of goes fast. We also have different spring blooming flowers that we need to think about because we're going to have a lot of hungry pollinators waking up next spring. And that's something that we can start planning for now. So this is kind of that planning step of IPM. So we can start planning for flowers that are going to be blooming in the spring to provide our early emerging pollinators with those resources. So think spring, plan ahead as much as possible. Think about planting bulbs and some of our flower seeds this fall and winter so that they can begin to get established. One note here is that native perennial species are an excellent resource for our pollinators, but it can take them some time to mature. So if the first year that you plant them, you don't feel like they come up very well, give them a second or a third year to really establish and take off. They're just a little bit slower to mature, so don't take them out after one season. Give them some time to establish. Think about the different cover crops we use. There's a lot of cover crops from buckwheat to cowpea to clovers, to a whole list that I'm happy to share in the future, that we can go ahead and put into our garden or our production system to protect our soil, but they will also begin to bloom early in the spring as well, and they can provide a great early season resource for our pollinators. Also, we want to try to reduce chemical use on our flowering plants. So this includes trees and shrubs. So if we have pest management that we need to do, we need to look at something called a residual time. So residual time is how long that chemical will be active in the plant that you're applying that chemical to. So we want to make sure that those insecticides are not going to be present in the pollen and the nectar when that tree flowers out in the springtime. So just pay attention to the time when we apply those. It might be better to wait until after the tree flowers in the spring so that there's a longer time for that chemical to move throughout the tree and away from where the nectar sources would be. And this is really important for systemic applications of insecticides. So also think about resources that you could provide pollinators in your yard. So this is things like stems and twigs. And we also have different water sources through bird baths that can provide water to our pollinators. The idea of leaving some bare ground patches, I know here in New Mexico we love to xeriscape and we love to put a lot of rock out and we like to put some heavy mulch out, which is fine, but try to leave some areas for pollinators to be able to access the soil and nest. So this might be not mulching all the way up to the base of your tree, leaving a little bit around it. It might be landscaping up to the front part of like a garden bed where you would see it visually, but behind the garden bed up to your house or up to an open area, leave that uncovered for pollinators.
Yeah, just come in. What is it? Okay.
Please don't forget to mute your mics if you're just joining us. So we also want to think about leaves in our yard. I know some of us don't have as many trees as we would like to have, but we do have some trees that are going to be dropping their leaves in our yard. So keeping leaves or a mulch layer can help to insulate pollinators, and they can build their nests there. Bees and butterflies will utilize these spaces. We also want to think about when we start to winterize our yards and our gardens that we want to avoid pests but support our pollinators. So I've got a couple do's and don'ts for us. So do things like composting and breaking up material and putting it in a single area. Don't just leave a pile of compost in your garden. It's not going to break down on its own. There's lots of great resources for how to compost material. So look into those so that you make sure you're doing it properly. A lot of our pests like to try to overwinter in some of this material that's not completely broken down. So that can be a problem for next year. This bottom picture here, on the left-hand side, we have perennials, and on the right-hand side, this is a picture of an annual plant that's dying back. So pollinators utilize the stems and stalks of a lot of our perennial plants. They'll build their nests if they're in the cavities, and sometimes they will use the soil around the base of those plants for nesting sites. So try to leave your perennial material as much as possible. But you want to try to remove the annual material from your yard, mostly because we have a lot of pests, especially in our vegetable production, that like to use that old plant material as habitat for themselves for the winter, and we want to try to reduce them in our systems as much as possible. So when we think about cleaning up our yards and our spaces, try to put things away nice and organized. Don't just leave piles of things in your yard. So this leads into the idea that pollinators interact across an entire landscape. So we need to take a landscape approach to their management. So having clean garden spaces that have plenty of flowers and resources is a great way to manage for pollinators, but we want to try to reduce areas that pests are going to be present and active. Try to remember too that there are going to be some things that are outside of your control, but you can help to mitigate. So think about your surrounding landscape. Make your garden or your yard or the area that you're managing an island for pollinators so that they can come and they can get the nectar that they need to drink. They can establish and build their nests, and then reach out to your neighbors, talk to the people in your community about how they can also help promote pollinator habitats. Remember that pollinators have a very large foraging range. So some pollinators may just go within 50 meters of their nest their entire life and never leave that area. And then some of our pollinators, like honeybees, may be going long distances. So again, it's the idea that we can't control things that are outside of our own property, but we can contribute to them through having conversations with our homeowners associations or working with local government to establish pollinator byways or using our own spaces as pollinator habitat. Remember that climate's going to play a role. We're going to see pollinators fluctuate in numbers and species given different climate changes that are going to happen. So just paying attention to the climate and things that we can do to improve that for our pollinators and provide them with the resources that they need. We have a lot of different resources on our pest management website that you can come and visit. We also have several social media pages where we update a lot of our information so that you guys can follow what we're doing and learn things in real time. And you can also email us if you've got questions, and that's our NMSU IPPM at nmsu.edu email. We also have a lot of different guides that we've put out, and we've got a lot that we're working on, but some that relate to pollinators are going to be our Backyard Beneficial Insects of New Mexico and our Pocket Guide to Native Bees of New Mexico. This will help you with your identification, with knowing different resources for the different pollinators that we're going to see. We also have several current projects that we're working on, so we love to have your guys' feedback and information on what you'd like to see us do. So we have different things happening. We still have our beautiful learning garden in Los Lunas that is designed around pollinators. And this is an open space that in non-COVID years, we would be having all sorts of different events in. So we'd love to see you soon to come visit that space. We've got different native plant plots that we're going to be releasing information about, that we've been doing some studies about which plants might be best for which types of pollinators. We're going to be having a pollinator lecture series throughout the fall, so feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to provide that information as well. We do different workshops. We have different monitoring programs that we're working with, and we're getting ready to launch some IPM for honeybee material. So please stay tuned and keep up with us. If you're looking for other local resources, the Cooperative Extension Service, there are agents in each county, and we have tribal agents as well that you can reach out to. They've got a lot of different social media pages and information that's very local to your county. So it's really great to get connected with them, to know what things are happening in your own county, to know what pest people are seeing, what pollinators people are seeing, how the community is interacting, so we can track what's happening with our pollinators. If you're looking for a few different resources for our pollinators, I'd also suggest checking out Dr. Olivia Carroll's book, The Bees in Your Backyard. This is great for pollinator identification. And then if you're looking for things related to butterflies and pests and things that might be in your garden, Garden Insects of North America is also a very affordable and excellent resource as well. So with that, I think we made it through in plenty of time to ask some questions. Please feel free to contact me